The last Renaissance poem for today, it's a poem by a gentleman named Ben Jonson, sometimes called Benjamin Jonson. Really, really incredibly famous guy during his lifetime. Not as famous today, but he was way more famous than Shakespeare when he was alive. So the poem's called On My First Son, and it's widely regarded as one of the finest elegies ever written in the English language. So we're going to look at that one today. I added the term elegy to our Renaissance lit terms list. You should already be familiar with it. We ran into a number of elegies in the Anglo-Saxon period, but an elegy is a formal death poem or a poem more generally about mortality. The Anglo-Saxon poems were more generally about mortality, but this is a formal death poem. As you can tell from the title, On My First Son, Ben Jonson had a son who died. It's actually an incredibly tragic story. His son got sick. And died on his 7th birthday. So he was turning 7 the day he died, which is particularly rough. I always have trouble. I always get a little choked up reading this thing. I have 2 sons. My youngest is 9. I remember trying to read this poem to the class, and his birthday's in February. So I read this to the class the year that he was turning 7, and that was a tough time. So I am going to jump over to Ben Jonson's Wikipedia page here. Again, always worth knowing a little bit about your authors, but the truth is that I would love telling you the story of Ben Jonson, even if I wasn't reading you his poem. His life is amazing, and you can go through here and you can look it up. He was born in 1572 and died in 1637. I'm just going to hit the highlights. I don't even need to go through and, talk about it, but you can read it. Ben Jonson is, just in general about literature, before I get into the awesome history of his life. He's kind of a jack of all trades and master of none. He was really good at everything he ever tried to do. He was a playwright. He wrote a lot of good plays. They're not the great plays that we study now, but they were very popular in his day. He also wrote masques, which were these really opulently rich and wealthy sort of entertainments for the queen and king, and they enjoyed those. He wrote poems of all different varieties. He wrote sonnets that were very good sonnets. He wrote songs that were very good songs. He wrote this elegy, one of the greatest elegies ever written. He wrote comic pieces. Really, he tried his hand at just about everything, and he was successful at everything that he did. He's just not sort of the top shelf of everything he did, and so in modern times, we don't tend to focus on him and remember him in all the same ways that we do with, say, Shakespeare. So he was a contemporary of Shakespeare, though, and he was certainly maybe the man that Shakespeare was most jealous of back when he was writing Sonnet 29. Let me tell you Ben Jonson's life. So Ben Jonson was the son of a bricklayer, and he was not destined for fame and fortune. Certainly not like Sir Philip Sidney, and certainly not born with a silver spoon in his mouth. In fact, he couldn't really go to school, like so many people who are of the lower classes. When he came of age, it was sort of expected that he would be a bricklayer, and he wanted to do other things with his life. And he didn't have the funds, he didn't have the connections, he didn't have the kinds of things that he needed, and so he ended up becoming a soldier. He joined the military. He shipped off. Remember how Sir Philip Sidney died in the wars against Spain in Holland. Ben Jonson went over to those wars too. His story of those wars is particularly awesome. First thing you need to know about Ben Jonson is he was huge. Local accounts of him refer to him as, quote, a mountain of a man, end quote. He was like 6'8" and enormously strong. And so in the war, apparently there's a story that Ben Jonson stepped out. There was always a no man's land between the two armies, right, where nobody went. Apparently, I guess a Spanish champion stepped out into that no man's land and challenged anybody on the English side to a duel. And the guy who stepped out to fight him was Ben Jonson. And the two of them had a duel, and Ben Jonson won. So that sort of set him up with a little bit of fame. After his little bit of fame in military conflict, he went back to England and then tried to turn that fame into an acting career. He started acting, he started writing, but then he became a bit notorious. It turns out that he had a creative dispute with another actor slash writer, and challenged him to a duel. Ben Jonson is big on dueling. Oh, unfortunately, dueling was illegal, and they went off and they had the duel anyway, and Ben Jonson killed the guy. The guy was higher class than he was, and so Ben Jonson was charged with murder. And so he was thrown in jail. Well, the courts at the time had two different courts. There was a high court for people of high birth. Generally, they would be, slapped on the wrist and spared for whatever it was that they had done. And there was a low court for people of low birth, and they would just be hanged. And so for murder, Ben Jonson was expected to be hanged. Well, there was this interesting clause in the low court rule book in the Code of Law, and it was called benefit of clergy. A clergyman is somebody who's involved with the church. So if you could prove that you knew Latin, you could be tried in the higher court. Ben Jonson didn't know Latin, and he had something like a month before his trial date, and so he learned Latin in a month, enough to have a conversation in Latin with the judge and be elevated to the higher court, where he was found guilty of murder, and his punishment was to pay a fine and have the letter M branded on his thumb. And he enjoyed that notoriety too. Like, he'd be in a bar apparently, and he'd walk up to somebody and be like, "You're going to buy me a drink." And when they were like, "No, I'm not," he'd be like, "See that M? Means I'm a murderer. I'll murder you." Right? And so then he'd get his drink. And so he became this sort of notorious, big personality, big physical presence guy. Started writing plays. He became then what England called the arbiter of fashion. Whenever a new play or a new book of poetry or anything came out, people didn't say whether they liked it or not. They waited for Ben Jonson to say whether he liked it or not. And if he liked it, they liked it too. And so what people wore, how people acted, it all depended on what Ben Jonson was doing with his life. And so he was at the very, very height of his popularity, and he decided to take a tour of Europe. And so he went away for 2 years and toured Europe. And when he came back, Shakespeare was the famous guy, and he was not. And he spent the rest of his life like the Backstreet Boys or NSYNC, like trying to recoup his popularity, and never actually successfully did so. But the man is a legend. He's absolutely amazing, and his history could be a novel. It would totally be worthwhile. However, there were tragedies in his life too, and the loss of his firstborn son on his 7th birthday was chief among them. And for that, he wrote this elegy, which we're going to read for class. There's a lot of other great Ben Jonson poems. I wish I had time to do them justice, but I don't. I've got to move on. We've got to hit metaphysical poetry and the Cavalier Poets before we're done with this abbreviated unit. And so I'm just going to give you the one and ask you, if you're interested, go look up some more and read them on your own. So On My First Son by Ben Jonson. I'll just read it to you, and then we'll look at the elements of the poem like we always do. Farewell, you child of my right hand and joy. My sin was too much hope of thee, loved boy. 7 years thou wert lent to me, and I thee pay, exacted by fate on the just day. Oh, I could lose all, Father, now, for why will man lament the state he should envy? To have so soon escaped the world's and flesh's rage, and if no other misery, yet age. Rest in soft peace, and asked say, here doth lie Ben Jonson, his best piece of poetry, for whose sake henceforth all his vows be such as what he loves may never like too much. Okay, so we know what the topic of this is from the title. I told you it's an elegy. I think that's pretty clear from the poem itself. Let's take a look at some of the poetic elements before we dissect what he's saying. Let's look at the meter. Farewell, thou child of my right hand and joy. It's 10. My sin was too much hope of thee, loved boy. 10. Iambic pentameter again. So you can almost tell just looking at the lines. You're like, wait, is this a sonnet? No, it's not a sonnet. It's 12 lines, not 14 if you count them. So it's not a sonnet. And then we look at the rhyme scheme. And the rhyme scheme here is, so we've got joy. It's going to be our first rhyme. It's A. and boy also an A, and pay is new, so it's B, and day is a B, and Y is a C, and envy, probably M by in the old way of pronouncing it, would be a C. Rage is a D, and age is a D, and lie, that's going with Y, and poetry. Again, we got that vowel shift, remember, so things are a little awkward there. And such and much is a new one. So what can we conclude from this is that it's written in couplets. We just have pairs of rhyming lines. It's the simplest rhyme there is. Given the subject of this poem, that it's about a child, it would make sense to have sort of childlike rhyme schemes. So that makes sense to me. Okay, he's also talking to his dead son. You can see that, farewell, you child of my right hand and joy. My sin was too much hope of you, loved boy. So he's talking to his dead son, which is going to be another literary term that you should be familiar with. That is an apostrophe, talking to something that cannot respond. The child is dead. So it's almost like you've got this elegy, this funeral poem, almost like it's being said at the gravesite to his son. So anyway, let's read this and make sense of it a little bit at a time. You'll see in terms of structure that each couplet is a complete sentence. We got a period here, we got a period here, we got a question mark here, we got a question mark here, we got a period here, we got a period there. So it's a series of 6 sentences, some questions, some statements, and all of them are going to unify into this overarching lesson about death. So, farewell, you child of my right hand. A child of my right hand is a weird thing for him to say unless you know the Hebrew translation of the name Benjamin, which means child of my right hand. And his son shared the same first name as him, so it's actually saying farewell to his son. But on a metaphorical level, I think he's saying that he would rather lose his right hand, lose his right arm, than his son. But he's not only saying farewell to his son in this line, he's saying farewell to you, my son, and my joy. He's saying goodbye to joy. He thinks he's never going to have a happy moment again. He's lost his son, and his joy is buried in the grave alongside him. Then he says, my sin was too much hope of you, loved boy. And he says, if I had a fault, it was all the hope I had for your future. He spent a lot of time thinking about his son and the days to come and the future they would have together. And so he had all of this hope for his son's future, and that was a mistake because now his son has no future. And of course, childhood death was a lot more common back then than it is now. So, for him to say it's a sin to think too far into the future when childhood mortality was high, it makes some sense. On some level, though, when he says sin here, he's wishing he hadn't spent that time and that thought and that emotional investment that he has. Then he says, 7 years you were lent to me, and I thee pay exacted by fate on the just day. So this is a reference to the fact that his son died on his 7th birthday. He's creating sort of a metaphor here. If you're looking for that, I'm going to put this all in italics. The metaphor is 7 years you were lent to me. His son was on loan from God. And it was a 7-year loan. That was, by the way, the long-term loan duration in the Renaissance. The most common long-term loan duration was 7 years. And so for his son to die on his 7th birthday, he's essentially metaphorically saying that his son was a loan from God and that God foreclosed, took it back, on his 7th birthday. And so that sort of caps the metaphor. But I think this is a powerful idea. We do tend to take our friends and family members for granted. And if we could think about people as being on loan from God, maybe it would be a new and a fresh perspective on the time that you enjoy with them. Then he says, oh, could I lose all, Father, now? The translation of that, I think, is that he never wants to be a father again. All of his fatherly feelings also are dead and buried with his son. Then he jumps into a rhetorical question. We've got 2 rhetorical questions that are interrelated, one after the other. He says, for why will man lament the state he should envy? And he asks this question. This is a question I think a lot of people ask, especially religious people, when people they love die. He says, why should I be sad when I should be jealous? If heaven is this perfect place and you have gone there, I shouldn't be sad for you because you're in that place that is perfect and full of happiness. Instead, I should be jealous of you. I should wish to be there too. So why do we as human beings, if we believe in heaven, if we believe in a perfect afterlife, why do we feel sad when people die? It's not for them. It's for us. We're sad for ourselves. Because in reality, you can see on the next question here, to have so soon escaped the world's and flesh's rage and if no other misery yet age. His son, I think it ties into this only the good die young sort of idea, but his son has escaped all the sorrows of the world. He was destined to grow up in this place, and this place, has problems. We have all of the rages of the world, all of the things that can hurt you mentally and physically. And then you get old and you have pain, and there's diseases, and there's wars, and there's poverty, and there's hunger. There's all of these negative things in the world. And even if you don't get any of them, you get old. And when you get old, your body hurts, and there's all the complications of old age. And his son is lucky to have escaped all that. He knows it. He sees it, but yet on some level he can't rationalize it and feel good for him. That's why we have these rhetorical questions. They're questions without answers. Why should I lament the state I should envy? I should want to be in heaven with you. Then he sort of changes subjects. You sort of almost get this vision of him looking at the gravestone. He says, rest in soft peace. And asked, say, here does lie Ben Jonson his best piece of poetry. Now, Ben Jonson was an egotistical man. He really believed in himself and his poetry and his plays, so much so that he self-published or had published a book of his collected works that he called the Collected Works of Ben Jonson. The only book to have it. This is Crosby. He is my cat. And apparently he wants to be on film. I'll just let him sit there. But the only book that had a title like The Collected Works of at that time period was Homer, the great poet of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And so he styled himself as sort of like the British version of Homer. Obviously he's not. But he was an egotistical man. And to say that his son was his best work of poetry is really something. And I don't know whether it's true, but I heard it said that is the inscription that was on his son's headstone when his son was buried. Here does lie Ben Jonson, his best piece of poetry. And that's in quotation marks. I haven't verified that. I suppose I could go online and try and verify it. For whose sake henceforth all his vows be such, as what he loves he may never like too much. And so at the end of this, Ben Jonson makes a vow. And his vow is he's never going to love anything as much as his son again, because it hurts too much to lose it. It's far better to only like things and never love them, because when you love things, you can lose them. And when you lose them, you never get over it. Or so Ben Jonson says at the end. And I feel like the grief is really palpable, the feelings of sorrow and regret, and it comes across really strongly in this poem. It does a very good job. And again, the whole thing's an apostrophe, talking to his dead son. All right, I'm going to read it to you one more time, and we'll call it done, and I'll close down the video. On My First Son by Ben Jonson. Farewell, you child of my right hand and joy. My sin was too much hope of thee, loved boy. 7 years you were lent to me, and I thee pay, exacted by fate on the just day. Oh, could I lose all father now, for why will man lament the state he should envy, to have so soon escaped the world's and flesh's rage, and if no other misery yet, age? Rest in soft peace, and asked, say, here does lie Ben Jonson his best piece of poetry, for whose sake henceforth all his vows be such, as what he loves may never like too much. Thanks, folks. Got to get this cat off my shoulders.